is listening to fine music. And Caddy Alley is actually my favourite. That was a wonderful choice, so thank you for that. I'm Paul Webley, I'm the director of SOAS. I'd like to welcome all of you in the audience tonight, especially those who've travelled a long way to be here, and to Professor Friederike Lüpke's friends, colleagues, and to Max. Welcome. We've got guests from many institutions here tonight. Some people have travelled a long way, and we really appreciate everyone who's here taking the trouble to be here. It all adds to the sense of occasion that's a SOAS Inaugural. This is a ceremony, it's a rite de passage for the speaker, it's a celebration, it's an enjoyable intellectual event for the whole community. I was talking to Friederike earlier about whether she was nervous, and she said no, although just a little bit, and we agreed she was nervous just the right amount to give a fine performance. Now, just to make sure it's an enjoyable event, I do need to do some housekeeping. So please turn off your mobile phones, and I'm just going to model that for you. This is a mobile phone. Okay, turn it off. Oh dear, it's not working again. Oh God. Right, this is an off mobile phone. Also note where the fire exits are. There's no scheduled fire drill, so if the bell goes, don't panic, but do leave quietly. I'm very pleased to preside over this inaugural lecture. It's the first one in 2015. It's the fifth of this year's series. Now, Professor Anne Storch will introduce Professor Lüpke tonight. She's Professor of African Languages at the Institute of African Studies and Egyptology in the Faculty of Arts and Humanities at the University of Cologne. She's particularly interested in epistemic language, local metalinguistic knowledges, indirect communication, meaningful variation, and vagueness in language. And I was particularly attracted by the last. I want to find out more about vagueness in language. That's great. More recently, she's developed a research interest in the field of heritage studies, exploring what makes languages part of intangible heritage, associates them with emotion, prestige, and symbolic wealth. She's a close collaborator of Professor Lüpke. They've published one book together. They're now working on the second one. And what's most remarkable about their camaraderie is that they can both have a real fight, a heated argument, or a deep discussion, I imagine that's all the same thing actually, about a topic, and then at the end of it feel that they both learned something new from the exchange and go away even better friends than they were at the beginning. Professor Anne Powles from SOAS will deliver the vote of thanks. She had her inaugural lecture here not long ago. She's Professor of Sociolinguistics and she's Dean of the Faculty of Languages and Cultures here at SOAS. And her main research focuses include multilingualism, language maintenance, shift, language policy in relation to language learning in schools and universities, as well as various aspects of the relationship between gender and language. And linguistic activism is focused on the promotion of the learning in languages in education, in particular the learning of community and minority languages, which is of course something that's very close to all of our hearts here at SOAS. Professor Powles is a great champion and a real supporter of Professor Lüpke's academic year and work. And what Professor Lüpke appreciates the most about the relationship, and I'm quoting Friederike here, is her no-nonsense attitude, which works very well with her, I'm quoting her here, blunt German personality. Well, just in the interests of scholarly accuracy, Professor Powles is, of course, Belgian and not German, so I say she's got a blunt Belgian personality. Your blunt personality, okay. We're very grateful to both of you for being part of today's event. At the end, you'll be invited upstairs to the reception in the Brunei suite for some wine and canapes. So, to introduce Professor Lüpke and the lecture, I'll now pass on to Professor Storch. Over to you.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, lieber Max. I'm very grateful to Friederike for asking me to present and introduce her to you tonight. Generally, I'm grateful because this is a wonderful opportunity to acknowledge the meaning of her work to African linguistics and her impact on the present and future debates in this very field. However, it is also a great opportunity to talk about, well, commitment, dauntlessness, and responsibility in African linguistics. Since when I know Friederike, I cannot say because I have forgotten about it. We may have first met on one of the Africanist conferences, maybe. We visited as students or postgraduates, or probably in a library, browsing through bookshelves, or perhaps during a visit one of us paid to the other one's university. I'm not really sure about this. Back then, Friederike studied African linguistics, general linguistics, and phonetics at the University of Cologne, and for some time in Paris. In 1999, she obtained her master, and by that time already had developed a strong interest in languages of West Africa, such as the Mande languages spoken in Guinea, Senegal, Mali, and so on. I suppose this is the time I must first have seen her somewhere. She then went on to Nijmegen, where she joined the Max Planck Institute for Psycholinguistics and obtained her PhD at the Radboud University. What finally and totally brought us together, so to say, was a workshop over there, aiming at teaching us language documentation, methodology, and probably field ethics too. And both of us had applied for documentation grants, and both of us took part in this workshop in order to get our absolutely diverging and unalike projects started. And both of us used the frequent coffee breaks to wonder where this was all leading us to, why certain things just wouldn't feel really right, and how we felt that some insights into African linguistic realities never really had become part of some of these academic discourses and practices. So we extended our coffee breaks to an extent that was probably not good, and entered into a discussion or conversation or both that since then have not ended. And this is where commitment, dauntlessness, and responsibility come in somehow, not discussing with Friederike, but what she's done since then. Friederike had used her time at Nijmegen and later at SOAS to become quite an excellent linguist. Already her PhD thesis on the argument structure of Jalonke, a language of the Mande family spoken in Guinea, and her many papers and other published work attest for this. But even though her contributions to linguistic theory and methodology met high standards and were much acclaimed by her colleagues, Friederike never would remain seated comfortably where she was, but rather set out to challenge established certainties, question received wisdom, and an academic status quo. Quite centrally, she began to critique the notion of a language, for instance, as something that is tied to a certain group's identity, that is exclusively spoken by such a particular group, belongs to them, and is based at the area where they live. Whatever we refer to when we talk about the field, we can almost be certain that it tells us other stories. Language there is hardly ever delimitable, is a concept and not so much a thing, has practitioners instead of just speakers, is not just structure but commotion, gesture, movement, noise, and silence. So how can all this be grasped using our established metaphors and methodologies, and how can it be put between book covers or kept pure and clean from other such things in archives devoted perhaps to preservation? Friederike, very early, almost from the beginning of her interest in language documentation, realized that multilingualism was the actual phenomenon that stood out, and not so much the potentially endangered diversity of singular, discrete languages. The elegance and social eloquence of multilingual speakers living in small villages of the Senegalese Casamance, in Dakar's urban spaces, or just in London, had often been described as a part of a problem, depicting those people as unable to preserve their linguistic heritage within so much linguistic fluidity, and often enough, they were also seen as less competent speakers who didn't know any of the 6 or so languages they lived with really well. Friederike's documentation on linguistic practices in the Bainung and Jola villages of southern Senegal and the microanalysis she and her team are now working on within the Crossroads project that she's currently leading are important contributions to a reflected, socio-linguistically informed and responsible approach to diversity, and it helps to place practices such as multilingualism in a framework that allows for a more holistic perspective on language. Such field research intensive work requires a lot of commitment and responsibility, not just traveling somewhere and spending time, but being a whole and real person and not seeing your hosts just as informants, but regarding them as whole and real and as well. Taking part in other people's lives, being open, being culturally open, and being a compassionate yet honest person is not always exactly easy in a context that is extremely rich in complex entanglements. And these complex entanglements will not let us work along preconceived plans easily, but may at any moment undermine our ideas about language and communality. And this is what I think is one of the many laudable contributions Friederike Lüpke has made and continues to make. Find new ways of doing research that helps us to understand the complexity of the entanglements of people thrown together. And the beauty of this complexity, for instance, manifests in the diversity of linguistic practices. What we can learn from this work is that it is precisely the careful critical evaluation of one's own position that opens up new perspectives, and both her texts and research are seen by an increasing number of especially younger scholars as inspiring examples of what this field can be made into. So turning your field into something new else or something else requires some dauntlessness, I think, besides responsibility. And Friederike Lüpke is certainly a person to always continue thinking and questioning. This makes her a great colleague and friend and a great person to engage in discussions with. And such discussions, all the thinking and questioning, are so productive and pleasant because they take place everywhere, not just in offices and meetings, but on playgrounds, in bars and galleries, airport terminals, schoolyards, cars, walking paths, in front of museums, on verandas, in waiting halls, ruins, restaurants, tramways, sidewalks, hills, conferences, and of course in draughty cafeterias. They're entangled as well with aspects of real life, personal existences and experiences, and they're as colorful and sometimes glittering as Friederike herself. I think SOAS is very privileged to have her. Friederike is, as I said, not just a wonderful friend and colleague, but also a scholar of true significance and of considerable wisdom. She also must be an inspiring teacher, considering the fantastic colleagues who became of her former students. So ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, it's a great pleasure to introduce to you Professor Friederike Lüpke, who will now speak about language diversity, African style.
Good evening, everybody. I think my nervousness levels may have gone up a little bit since I talked to Paul upstairs. Let me start by saying a big multilingual thank you, not just to everybody who is here tonight, but also to the many friends, colleagues, and family members who have taken an interest in my work and who have supported me in many ways over the years. I would like to single out only two persons tonight. First of all, I think the person who has traveled from by far the most remote place tonight, well, not remote really, but far, Abidjan, my dear friend Anne Storch, who is here. And the next person I have to single out is my son, Max. And I know he may be embarrassed, but I still have to say this, Max. Max has been a precious research assistant, and he is a very experienced kind of academic. He attended his first conference at the tender age of 6 weeks, I believe. And at 8 years of age, I think he has at least as much fieldwork experience as many holders of PhDs in field linguistics. He is still trying very hard to make me achieve a good work-life balance, as you can see. But now, to something completely different. Time for the serious business. Some preliminaries are in order. So I've prepared this very brief roadmap for tonight's lecture. It is a mere pretext to offer you a very short sentimental journey through my academic upbringing, which also fostered my developing understanding of West African multilingualism. And then I will zoom in on Senegal and current collaborative research in the Crossroads project that I lead. And finally, I will try to zoom out a little bit and answer briefly the question of why this is interesting and should be interesting beyond an Africanist context. So the journey starts in Côte d'Ivoire. Then we move to Mali and the Manda world, over to Guinea. Very brief stopover in Cameroon. And then we zoom in on Senegal. Oh, I also should say, if you spot some unorthodox visuals, Max, in order to prevent you from being bored tonight, I have hidden 10 special messages just for you. Okay, there are 10. So, let's see if you spot them. So, people who know me know that music and dancing are very central to my life. And so, as to not to disappoint them, I am going to start with a song by the Cote d'Ivoirian reggae star Alpha Blondy. Incidentally, it's also a song that makes a very strong stance against dating educated women, but I will not dwell on that. And while you're listening, you may want to ponder the question at the bottom of the slide: how many languages are there in this song? Okay, any audience guesses? Anybody who would dare to make an educated guess? 3. Okay. 7. Okay. Okay. Any higher bidder? Okay, well, actually, let me start with the punchline. There is no right answer to this question. There are possible answers, though. The leaflet that comes with the CD gives one answer that is only possible in writing, where you can actually keep languages discrete. In this case, Dioula, the de facto national language of Ivory Coast, a Manda language, is written in italics, and French is the normal case. And then you can see that there are 2 languages in this song. But then you will find things like amour, papier, longueur, that appear to be French, but that are probably not really transparent for any speaker of cosmopolitan French. Bakpato, which means sweet talker in, well, Nushi, maybe, or Ivorian popular French. Terms like Jaheli, Sochila, Karabanchi Aho, that actually nobody knows these days, so we don't know whether they're actually a particular Alpha Blondy idiolect. Kif Kif, does Alpha Blondy know that this term originally comes from Moroccan Arabic and then has entered French? Argo? 50-50. Well, it belongs to English, but does Alpha speak English and did he mean to use English? And so on. So actually, it may not make too much sense to approach multilingual practices with this system question, how many languages there are, but it makes more sense to look at them as fluent and ever-changing practices. By thinking in this way about languages, I'm in very good company here at SOAS, and I couldn't restrain myself from putting together a little collage out of inaugurals of my predecessors. So just to give you a little flavor of what other people at SOAS think about very similar topics, and that is kindred in spirit.
You can see it's all white middle-class male. And
transformation. When I came to Cambridge, I found that Fitzwilliam College was all men.
Let's live in a language world that is, on the surface, discrete and sovereign.
Transformation.
Within imagined linguistic borders. Languages have borders.
Transformation.
And home security checkpoints.
But also from development of linguistic theories such as analysis of morphosyntactic variation and language contact. And it's that interface between better descriptions and theoretically informed questions which I think makes Bantu studies and linguistics in general very exciting at the moment.
Transformation.
We continue to face a variety of centrisms, particularly the monolingualism and therefore monoculturalism of any national literary field.
Cognitive act of interpreting and generating dialogue.
Transformation.
It's a classic model of language comparison which assumes that languages develop over time like branches of a tree. So,
transformation.
In anthropology and linguistics.
So, you can see that at SOAS we're perceiving the world in ways that differ from mainstream discourses that want to see languages as discrete entities, views that have a strong Eurocentric bias, views that lack gendered perspectives, but at the same time, these views still dominate the mainstream discourse. And these are, of course, the symptoms of very strong language ideologies, ideas and beliefs that everybody has about language and its role. And before I start my sentimental journey, I thought, in starting my sentimental journey, I thought it would be good to evoke those language ideologies at the same time to try to make us all more aware of them. So, who creates these language border that Wen Qin evoked in her inaugural? A very famous linguist has coined the phrase, well, a language is a dialect with an army and a navy. Now, for Africa, you can safely paraphrase this with the following dictum. And, of course, you could slot in, instead of missionary or missionary linguist, anthropologist, maybe, an NGO or a lobby organization. A case in point that I have to mention here is the Dogon country in Mali, because when I was a graduate student, one of my earliest experience was as a junior expert for the German Technical Cooperation, and I was sent with a team to help implement the Dogon language into primary education, because the Dogon language had been identified as one of the then 4 national languages of Mali to be introduced into primary education. Very laudable goal, I thought at the time. So here you see the Dogon are one of the most mysticized groups of Africa. They had a very famous anthropologist too. And so they're very vivid in popular imagination, not just because of their cosmology, which may or may not be based on a very special relationship with Sirius B. And so the Dogon are really almost mainstream in the general consciousness regarding African tribes. So here you can see an example of this, a Dogon village recreated in the Africa Museum in Repertoires in the Netherlands that looks more authentic than any Dogon villages would look these days, probably. So, the Dogon and the Dogon language, that's the mission we had, implement the Dogon language. This was prior to any detailed linguistic research on the Dogon languages. And when we came there, we were met with fierce resistance by representatives of the Dogon communities who said, well, but you know, we speak a bunch of totally different languages and we actually don't understand each other. And of course, these objections were totally swept aside because there was a short-term development goal that needed to be reached. Recent research has revealed that the Dogon speak about 29 related varieties, and there's also a linguistic isolate, a language that is not really related to the Dogon languages, but is spoken by a group that sees itself as culturally Dogon. And the Dogon are very multilingual, and multilingualism is inscribed in their very myth of origin. So to approach this group with the idea, you speak one language, and if your languages are a little bit different, we need to standardize them, because otherwise your language cannot be developed, was a big fallacy. And making this experience was a big eye-opener for me and a lesson to try and look closer. In my next experience, my PhD research on a small language, also a Mande language spoken in the Fouta Djallon area of Guinea, I tried to look closer, but it was only towards the end of my research that I became aware of the powerful ideologies surrounding writing and of the fact that I actually hadn't looked closely enough in trying to assist people in writing their language. Djallonke is a very small language, and people wanted me to help them develop a primer, a syllabary, to help them write the language, which I dutifully did. Here it is, beautiful booklet. A lot of work went into it, but it was only towards the very end of my research that I discovered that, in fact, people in this area, all, or many of them at least, used to write a different language, the majority language Fula, in a script, a so-called Ajami script, which means the writing of a language other than Arabic in Arabic letters. And so while my andrographic writing leaflet had a great symbolic importance, it was of no practical use at all. Yet the fact that a language can be written is of a great ideological importance for a language to be seen not as a dialect, un parler, un patois, but to actually acquire languagehood in the public imagination. Very often it is not just writing, but it is also the right writing, of course, orthography, that creates a language. And there are fierce ideological debates about what the right writing could look like. The first African language I learned was Bambara, also a Mande language, also called Manding, closely related to Dioula and the most widespread national language of Mali. And there is an official orthography for Manding that you can see here. It's in the Latin script with some special characters that come from the International Phonetic Alphabet. Ultimately, this alphabet goes back to missionary efforts starting in the 19th century. Now, I learned this alphabet and also the purified Bambara language that is attached to it as a student. And when I came to Bamako, me and my fellow students stuck out like sore thumbs because we were immediately identifiable as the people who spoke the language invented by the Direction de l'Alphabétisation, a very pure, archaic Bambara, cleansed of any foreign influence. Nobody speaks this purified language, and almost nobody writes Bambara in the official orthography, although Bambara is actually written quite a lot. If it is written in the Latin script, it is written in an orthography that uses French norms, and I will talk about these lead languages and their role in writing languages a bit later. There's also a tradition to write Bambara in Arabic letters, in Ajami, that is pretty much alive. And there's also the Nko alphabet, which was invented in the 1940s by a pan-Manding activist. And these three are used by different constituencies for different, to express different facets of identity in different contexts. You can see an example of this in this multilingual and multiscriptural sign in the heartland of the Manding Empire in Kaba. You can probably not read everything that is written here, but let me point out to you that the only spelling that is not represented here is the standard orthography for Bambara. All other spellings are attested. After having done my PhD and after having come to SOAS, I did a little bit of research on the interplay between multilingualism, written and spoken multilingualism, and multi-script use in Cameroon, which is one of the most linguistically complex African countries. And here I'm only going to give you a snapshot of the city of Fumban, which is quite famous because it has had a monarchy of kings for quite some time. Recently, I think in the 19th century, it's converted into a sultanate. So there is a dynasty that goes back a long time. And inspired by the Germans who colonized this part of Cameroon in the 19th century, the Sultan Joya also invented a syllabary, a script to write Bamun, the language spoken in Fumban. And this script is still seen as expressing the local Bamun identity, although it is not really written outside the palace school. What is written, what you can see in the linguistic landscape of Fumban, although people who see themselves as Bamun will not often see that as part of their identity, is Ajami writing in Hausa and Fula, Fulfulde, or Arabic, if the Arabic script is used, or Latin writing in French. Crucially, identities are multiple and not mutually exclusive. And one important thing I had to learn during my research, particularly during my research in Cameroon, is that not all aspects of identity are revealed at all times. And here I'm only going to give you an example that is at the same time an example of observer's paradox. So the fact that something that you want to, that if an observer is present, the very practices that he or she is trying to observe change because of this presence. And this is particularly often the case when it comes to culturally charged language practices, like the use of particular writing systems and scripts or certain genres. Ajami writing is very often not well liked by Western observers, and Western observers are very often stakeholders of Western education. And so it took me a long time when I was in Cameroon, particularly here in Ngaoundéré, to actually find and interview students of Quranic schools. Whenever I asked in neighborhoods, or I asked in mosques, people said, no, all our children go to state schools. Everybody here learns French or English. Nobody goes to madrasas. But I said, well, but I can see the heap of children's shoes at the entrances of the courtyards, which is a clear sign that there must be a Quranic school. And I can hear the children reciting the Quran, so there must be a Quranic school. And the Quranic schools are the places where Ajami writing is also learned by at least some of the students as a side effect of learning the Arabic script. So it took me a long time to establish sufficient trust to be actually led to these Quranic schools and to be able to talk to the students there. So a reminder that not everything is what it seems to be at face value. You really have to look. So, now it's time to go to Senegal, where my current research is located. I have been doing research in Senegal since 2008. So before I go into our current research, let me set the scene for you a little bit. Senegal is a multilingual country. I think there is no monolingual in Senegal. There are two scripts used in Senegal mainly, the Latin and the Arabic script, but not everybody masters the two, and there are many people who do not write at all. There are official literacies and unofficial ones, but norms, the official norms, are not the most important ones, and I will get into that in detail a little bit. Senegal is a moderately multilingual country by African standards. According to the ethnologists, it has 30+ languages, but bear in mind that there is no absolute and linguistic meaning to the term language. If we take a standard polyglossic look at Senegal, that is, if we look at languages having a functional differentiation and hierarchical relationships holding between them, so some of them have a higher status than others, Senegal would look like this. At the top, you would have French, which is the official language, the ex-colonial language, which occupies all official contexts. Then you would have some trans-local languages, languages of wider communications. And then you would have a high number of languages used more or less in local contexts. If we look at written multilingualism, we get a very different picture. So the official language of Senegal is French. That's the only language that has official status as a language of writing. French and Arabic are the only languages that are official media of instruction in schools. But all languages of Senegal can attain a certain status, that of a national language, through their codification. And there is a growing number of languages that have attained this status. Here is a text that illustrates the codification of Bainouk. So, Bainouk is a cover term for a cluster of languages that are spoken in pockets that are not adjacent to each other. They're mutually unintelligible. People of Bainouk ethnicity claim to more or less pronounced degrees a common ethnic identity, but they have no linguistic unity. They speak French or other languages of wider communication with each other. Now, this cluster has been codified as the Bainouk language, which means it has been demonstrated that it can be written with the standard Senegalese alphabet. And so this has been submitted to the Ministry of Education, and text samples in 3 Bainouk languages have been provided to illustrate this. This means Bainouk can be written, but if we want to look at what is actually written, the picture looks very different. So, first of all these languages that are more or less locally confined go away. Even if they can be written, even if they have been codified, they are not actually written. So also the languages of wider communication go away, apart from a number that are written in the Arabic script, in Ajami writing, mainly for religious and poetic purposes, but without official status. What remains as visible and official literacy is French in the Latin alphabet and standard spelling, and then we have French also in the Latin alphabet, with a Francicized but non-standard spelling in messages and social media, which is by far the most frequent actual use of literacy. If we compare speaking and writing, we kind of get very diverging pictures. My colleague Caspar Juffermans uses to say that if you would send a deaf and a blind researcher to West Africa, they would come to totally opposing views regarding which languages are used, because what is most written is spoken the least, and vice versa. So, just because I hate slides that have only text, I had to put this diagram in. Yeah, either you're spoken a lot and hardly written, or the inverse. I mentioned before that there are lead writing cultures, as I have called them. So, to give you an example of this shop sign that also makes some a religious advertisement for Serigne. So you have French, then you have Wolof in Francicized spelling, and then you have the same in Wolof Ajami. And Wolof Ajami doesn't use classical Arabic, but it uses a regional writing tradition, the so-called Warsh tradition, that has some special characters, sounds that are not found in Arabic. So if I want to transcribe this in standard Wolof using the official alphabet for Senegalese languages, this would look like this. Warsh, writing for the Manda language Mandinka, also spoken in Senegal, is illustrated by my very erudite and formidable main consultant Alpha Mane, who also created the video that I'm going to show you himself. And please pay attention to the visual setup in which he puts himself for shooting this video.
Les scripts mandingues ont toujours utilisé les lettres de l'alphabet arabe pour pouvoir transcrire le mandingue, à l'exception de quelques lettres qui n'existent pas en arabe et qui apparaissent dans la langue mandingue. Par exemple, nous avons cette lettre-là, la lettre Ñ, Ñ, qui peut être transcrite de cette manière ou de celle-là.
Okay, so he's telling you that this alveolar nasal has a particular digraph in the Warsh tradition, although in classical Arabic and also in the official standard that has been developed for the writing of African languages, the caractère coranique harmonisé, there would be no contrast between the alveolar and the palatal nasal. They would both, so N would both be written with the Arabic nun. Also note that Alpha is one of the few people who actually use this symbol because he's a trained transcriber, because he transcribes for me, has been doing so for the past 4 years. And most people would use the francisized digraph GN, ny, to write the alveolar nasal. Okay, now let's turn to the place that is closest to my heart, Casamance, an area in southern Senegal where I've been doing research, well, since 2008 and since 2014 in a big collaborative project. And here you can see my fantastic team, at least some of them. This was our farewell party about a month ago, I think, in our field base. So really, thank you guys. You're fantastic. I would have not gained a fraction of the insight that I hope to convince you that we have gained on multilingualism Casamance without working together. If you travel to Casamance, you have to travel there either by plane or by boat. By boat is by far the more pleasurable way to get there. Then the landscape looks like this. So here we are on the river Casamance, and you see a marshland crisscrossed by creeks, very swampy, very inaccessible. And the geography has played an instrumental role in shaping the linguistic landscape of the area. This is an area where small communities have thrived. You could not have big settlements, you could not have big state formations. Horses, well, they could not actually travel here, but also there's the tsetse fly, so you can't have horses. So you had small, relatively autonomous, decentralized societies that were at the same time independent, but also very vulnerable because of their small size and also because this area was one of the centers of the transatlantic slave trades, in which the communities settling there were both actors and victims. This has led to a very complex linguistic landscape, and adopting the color code that you're already familiar with, I give you some languages of particular locations. It's impossible to put them all on the map. Many of them we don't have any research yet. Then some regional languages, and finally the national lingua franca. There is a localist language ideology to identify languages. So very often you have a village. So for instance, you would have G Belor, G being the prefix for a location, and then you would have the language of G Belor, and in these languages with noun class prefixes, elegantly, you would just use the noun class prefix for language. So, Gibelor is the village, Gubelor is the language of that village, etc. And I work in a village that doesn't have this localist naming. I work in Agnac, a village to the east of Ziguinchor, the main capital. And in order to make the multilingualism more accessible to you, I wanted to show you a video clip. It's a clip from a documentary called Can Rachel that was created by a team led by Remigius Sova, who participated in an AHLC-funded skills development scheme, during which I took a number of interns to my field site in 2013, which was a brilliant experience. And beautifully, as a result, we have this documentary, which will be screened for the first time in the UK in September 2015 at a British Academy conference on multilingualism that I'm organizing with Anne Storch. So if you like the clip and you want to come back for more, register for the conference. The clip gives you a little bit of a narrative. So it tells you some meaningful facts of the biography of the young woman you're going to meet, Maria Madiandi, to make you understand some of the motivations for multilingualism as well.
Comme tous les matins, À l'aide des autres jeunes filles du ménage, Myriam est en train de balayer la cour. Quant à Myriam, elle parle 6 langues. Elle est une nièce de Meta, la femme de Benjamin, et vient de Guinée-Bissau. Originellement une locutrice de Gougetia, une langue liée au Goudjaheur. Elle est venue au village à l'âge de 5 ans pour s'occuper de Martine, l'une des filles de Benjamin et Meta. Martine elle-même a été confiée à une sœur à Benjamin qui à l'époque était sans enfant et qui vit dans un village proche. La famille de Benjamin attend beaucoup de visiteurs, mais sans frigo ni électricité, tout doit être préparé et consommé sur le coup. Parmi les peu de choses que l'on peut garder, il y a les condiments. Et cet après-midi, Myriam va aller au marché pour en acheter, en portant sa robe préférée pour marquer l'occasion. En route, elle rencontre des amis, une opportunité parfaite pour bavarder un peu. En retournant, Myriam s'arrête dans la boutique pour acheter quelques bonbons pour les enfants.
Okay, so as you have seen in this clip, people in Casamance, without exaggeration, speak between 3 or 10 languages on average. And these languages can be both very closely related, but also... Sorry? We were still in Senegal, yes? Yeah. Yes? Yes? Sorry, but I mentioned all that in the introductory slides, so maybe you can ask me your... Maybe you can ask me your questions. Maybe we can have this discussion after the lecture during the reception, if you don't mind. So, the repertoires are very dynamic because people are very mobile, as you have seen in the video clip. So, like the young woman in the clip, many women, particularly women, are fostered to help bring up children or to help elderly relatives. In this society, which is very local, it's also women who change villages very often when they marry. And then, of course, there's seasonal migration for economic reasons. There's also religious and ritual mobility. And all this brings languages together. And we'll show you another brief example. This is a woman that I've known under two names. The Christian name Hélène Colli and the Muslim name Tay Suko. And initially I thought, oh, this is a Bainouk woman because she's the mother of my main consultant who is Bainouk, and I knew that he had told me, il est de père et mère Bainouk. When she told me her second name, I thought, oh, she must have switched to Mandinka. Mandinka is a majority language. The Mandinka have been coming into this area. They have been waging a jihad in the 19th century. And many people shift to Islam and also to Mandinka. So I thought, oh yeah, this is just another case of language shift. Nothing out of the ordinary here. But it actually turned out, and it took me more than a year to get behind this, that this woman spoke Bainouk, spoke Mandinka, spoke another bunch of languages, but she had changed her language as part of a fertility ritual, the so-called gubos. So if a woman is infertile or loses many children at a young age, she is believed to be possessed by a spirit. And so she kind of has to go undercover. She has to be hidden from the spirit, which means she gets a new name, new identity, very often gets to live somewhere else. And in this case, Hélène Colli was put into the compound of a marabout and took on his name and took on Mandinka identity that stays with her, but it has not erased her Bainouk identity. It's just an additional layer that she has added in order to be healed from her infertility, which she eventually was. Some more snapshots on Repertoires. This is Benjamin Mane. So he speaks two local languages, and he nominally is a Bainouk. He speaks a number of regional lingua franca, and he speaks the two national languages of wider communication of Senegal. If you look at his wife, her repertoire looks very different. She also speaks Guyara, but she has learned it later because she is originally a speaker of Gugutcher, and she comes from a village in Guinea-Bissau and has been married into this community. And hence, her regional lingua franca are also different, and she doesn't speak French. Meta hasn't been to school. If she had been, she would speak a little bit of Portuguese and a lot of Creole, the languages of schooling and the official languages of Guinea-Bissau. So big difference already in one household. A child, to give you an example, this is Emily Sadio, also known as Yombe. Yombe came in shortly before I started my research in Agnac. She is a foster child, and her identity is Pepel, but her Pepel is now fading because she's been in Agnac for 4 years, and she's now a fluent speaker of Bainouk Guyara, although she'll never qualify as a Guyara, as an identity Guyara. She has picked up one regional language so far, and she speaks Wolof, and she is learning French because she's now living in a Francophone country. Had she remained in Guinea-Bissau, or should she ever return, then her repertoire would readjust accordingly. There are some settings with fixed linguistic choices. Places of worship are a case in point, but very often there are particular conventions that regulate language use. And these, in Diboncaire, where my colleague Alex conducts his research, there is a shrine that is not addressed in the nominal language of Diboncaire, which would be a Bainouk language, Bainouk Goberher, but in the language, the nominal language of the neighboring kingdom of Mafavi, because this shrine is subordinate to the reign king of Mafavi. And this illustrates one of the motivations for multilingualism. In this case, it strengthens ties between communities. It serves to forge alliances, for instance, defense alliances, symbolic ties that are kept alive, among other things, through multilingualism. This is, at first sight, astonishing, in particular because there's so much cultural syncretism in this area. Most of the practices which I've listed here for you are either identical or very similar, and many rituals are timed across the area, which we recently learned, which is really fascinating. So they actually draw in everybody in a very scripted way. Now, so case in point, I couldn't resist to put up this picture. So here you see a very recent male initiation that united two villages, Brin and Diboncaire, with two different nominal languages. So already it is an officially bilingual event. And of course we thought that it would attract members of the diaspora who often don't speak these languages. We would speak languages of wider communication. But what Alex found out, there he is, an initiated Bainuk, was actually that this ceremony systematically involves all the other villages in this. We start to see it as a cultural and linguistic ecology. They come, so delegations of initiates come and take part. So it's also part of cultural exchange system. This is very unexpected from a polyglossic perspective that has a kind of utilitarian view on languages. So, you know, you are a language, you have a domain, and some languages are better than others, and so they are higher. So it's a big question for us to try to find out why people remain so multilingual and in so many small languages when their practices converge so much. So why don't people adopt simpler patterns of multilingualism? And here are some possible scenarios. I mean, if you would speak one of these tiny languages and one regional language of wider communication, and then the two languages that you can't get away without, that would already make 4 languages. You would think that would be enough, right? So why are people so indulgent and speak these many small languages and don't do this? Or why don't people actually adopt one creolized version of the many small languages that are closely related? So why do people speak, as is the case in the Crossroads area, 3 or 4 Diola languages which are really closely related? You know, sometimes closer than, let's say, Low German dialects and Dutch. You know, why don't they get away with that and adopt one creolized version? And, you know, they would happily understand each other. They don't do that. This is even more puzzling when you look at the ideologies. And the ideologies are very essentialist. You know, so you are a Bainuk and you speak Bainuk. You are a Diola and you speak Diola, etc. But at the same time, the ideologies are essentialist, but they're not absolute. So you pick one language as an identity language, but there are different levels of granularity, for instance, that you can adopt. So very often people have one local identity that is not really revealed to outsiders, like, you know, the affiliation at the village level. There's one intermediate level, and even that can be cancelled. So normally Diola and Bainuk would be pretty much mutually exclusive in Casamance, but both Alex and I have recently come across people who say, yeah, I'm a kind of Bainuk Diola, you know. But this contrasts with the kind of way identities are portrayed. So here you can see a procession, one of the many cultural festivals that are mushrooming in Senegal at the moment. And, you know, really processions with labels where you have here the Kosse Bainuk, although this is a mass dance that, you know, you can see in Manding villages, in Diola villages, etc. So, okay, next question then. Why are the ideologies so essentialist? And why is the contrast between ideologies and practices upheld in specific situations? Gosh, I'm getting really hot, but I don't dare taking off my hat because I don't know what has been done to my hair, so I think I'll just get hot. So, but let me try to get through this with the hat. As I have alluded to, identities are contextualized, and since they're different contexts, the identities are also multiple. And this makes sense. If you look back at the slide that I showed you of Casamance, you know, at this marshland with these small groups, this is a classical African frontier situation where you can only thrive as a small group, or at least that was the case until the very recent past. But at the same time, in order to survive as a group there, you need to be very flexible and multiple and forge several alliances, or as my colleague Pierpaolo Di Carlo says, you have to put your eggs into several baskets. And one way of doing this is to speak several languages, because they can serve to index different affinities as required by a particular context. It's difficult to tell which was first. The exchange patterns, like the marriage patterns, you know, where the women travel, of course that creates bonds, but then that brings different languages into the group, or the languages, but it is the case clearly now that the languages are also a very important index of these differences that are used for this purpose. So, to return to Hélène Colli, alias Tei Suko, according to her very contextualized needs, she can reveal herself to be a woman that has undergone this fertility ritual as a Muslim, as a Ujahar, as a Christian, as a Jola, as a Bainuk, as a Mandinka, etc. And that is not mutually exclusive at all, because multilingualism is part of a larger semiotic system in which individuals can assert their belonging to different groups at different times. And remember the dress code that Alpha had in the video he shot when he demonstrated Ajami writing. So I had this beautiful robe, which is a classic robe associated with Islam. So he clearly framed himself as an Islamic scholar. And then he had this beautiful carpet with the Arabic calligraphy, and I can swear that does not hang normally on that wall. So it was put there on purpose. And this is the same Alpha Mane who, you know, sports a T-shirt making publicity for Senegal's largest mobile network. And this is actually the most technologically versed transcriber I've ever seen, and the only one who masters our complex linguistic softwares and is writing text messages in the official orthography for Bainuk languages. So there is not one essentialist identity. There are multiple, and they are also expressed in multiple ways. Okay, I'm almost there. Please bear with me. I know we're all getting thirsty. But I have to return to this question because, as you have seen, there are so many ideologies attached to writing, and we are also graphocentric by upbringing, and it is very often actually invoked that small languages can be strengthened through writing. And symbolically, this is certainly true. Writing has great symbolic power. This is exemplified in the statutes of a lobby organization that has been lobbying for Bainuk languages and culture since the 80s. So I've tried to translate it for you. What you can see here is that, yes, they see the importance of writing, but it's more reactive to the existence of other writing languages that would actually marginalize the non-written languages, and that's something we should not forget. At the same time, writing, as it's stated here, always goes hand in hand with codification, stabilization, because otherwise it would not be economical to write with modern technological means. And so writing actually suppresses and diminishes the very diversity it is here supposed to enhance and support. And of course, speakers of Bainuk are aware of that at a practical level. So in practice, they actually remain exographic in writing and do not write their language. And I can illustrate this with leaflets and materials produced by this organization itself. So you can see that flyers are in French. Even this T-shirt that invokes l'identité culturelle, cultural identity, does so in French. So there is a big divergence between the symbolic power of writing and its actual use and usability. Writing remains instrumental to achieve a high status, but that's a status that follows a polyglossic logic. And these languages actually operate in the shade of polyglossia to a large extent. So they can actually, so here you see a photo from an orthography workshop we had with speakers of different Bainuk languages. So, and you see a border pub activist at the whiteboard, and he knows the standard orthography for Bainuk languages by heart. And he corrects every tiny mistake anybody could make. But he has never written a single word in this orthography. Zooming out. Why is this interesting? I've been groomed to answer this question by one of my early mentors, Sotaro Kita. So I try my very best to tell you now, it's a pity that the gentleman has left, why this is important. So, we have this beautiful diversity, but most of its patterns remain unstudied till today. Multilingualism as a subject is studied, but is mainly looked as a recent and urban phenomenon that involves globalization. And if there's research that focuses on non-Western settings, it's mainly settings that involve contact, code switching between one Western language and one, maybe two African languages. And this is far removed from the complex realities we have seen here, and they're far from being exceptional in Africa. On the contrary, small-scale multilingualism is globally much widespread and has only been eliminated in the contact with Western invaders and Western language ideologies in those parts that had settlement colonies. Till today, small-scale multilingualism is conceptualized as involving contact between neighboring groups, and many linguists still call them tribes. But I hope I have shown to you that it's not adequate to look at these groups as homogeneous groups that then have neighbors that are different. Groups are heterogeneous. And the language use of many actors in these perceived homogeneous groups has not been studied, and that's why they can actually appear so homogeneous. Well, okay, so still, why should we bother? Well, to give you one recent example, we should bother because only if we actually pay attention to actual patterns of multilingualism can we develop better communication strategies for crisis communication, for development communication, but also for education systems. In many of the countries I've been talking about, in particular in Francophone Africa, the official education systems are not very successful. And one large factor is a really failed linguistic policy. But to give you just one example, a very recent one, Ebola prevention posters, a considerable effort has been made by NGOs like Translators Without Borders to produce written Ebola prevention information in a variety of languages of wider communication in West Africa. Here are some examples for two languages spoken in Sierra Leone and Liberia, Creole and Mende. And now what you see here is, so first of all, they're both in the Latin script. Now, in order to learn the Latin script, you need formal schooling. If you have formal schooling to the level that you can read this, then you understand enough English to be able to read an English Ebola leaflet. On the contrary, nobody, apart from a handful of participants in literacy campaigns, has ever been exposed to these standardized orthographies that use special characters that are not familiar to people who have learned the official language. So a very costly mistake that cannot actually reach its intended audience effectively. There are initiatives, many African initiatives, but also one at SOAS of reaching out orally for Ebola prevention. So Carlos Chirinos, from our very own SOAS Radio, for instance, has produced the song Africa Stop Ebola, one of the many songs that are much more successful in reaching and telling the message that is intended to be told by these. So, my very last slide. The world does not look like this. It does not. Even if ideologies, and very often male-centered ideologies, want to tell us it is. And one last anecdote to really drive home the point. Recently, I was talking to somebody, a man from West Africa, a speaker of a small, locally confined language, who was very concerned about the future of his language. And he said, and I don't understand, people speak all these other languages. If only everybody would speak their mother tongue, then we would be fine. And our community language would thrive and survive. And I said, oh, that's interesting. So tell me, okay, so how big is your community? And he said, well, it's like 2 villages. I said, okay. So people in these villages, they only marry within these villages. And he said, no, the women, no, they always come from outside. So, the women speak this and this and this. And so, and the women from your village, well, most of them leave the village. And I said, okay. And how about children? Do biological children always grow up with their parents and stay with them? Oh, no, you can't foster them. And so I said, okay, so isn't it the case that actually everybody is speaking their mother tongues, plus the mother tongues of everybody else? So isn't it an illusion to think that your community has only one language? And I'm not sure I convinced him, but I hope I have convinced you that this is the makeup of communities. Thank you.